Okay, so have you ever like watched a true crime thing and they're like, we know from the bones, and you're thinking, how?
Right, like what are you talking about?
Totally. So that's what we're getting into, forensic anthropology. And we've got excerpts from the use of forensic anthropology that, don't worry, it's way more interesting than it sounds.
It's true, this isn't your grandma's textbook. It's about how much you can learn from skeletons. I mean, we're talking secrets that can be like hundreds of years old.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But before we get to all that, imagine for a second you find a skeleton like out in the woods. What's going through your head?
I think my first question would be, how did this get here? Like, is this a crime scene or just some really old bones? It's amazing how this whole field came about, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Like, imagine trying to explain this 100 years ago. You'd be laughed out of the room, right?
Probably.
But wars, as awful as they are, that's when things really changed. Suddenly, being able to identify the dead, often from just their skeletons, became so important. And every case, every new technique led us to where we are now.
It's like a puzzle with the highest stakes possible.
Exactly. And speaking of puzzles, the book talks about this crazy case, the Dr. Parkman murder, back in the 1800s.
What happened?
So this doctor goes missing, right? Last seen at his colleague's place. Turns out the colleague owed him a ton of money.
Oh, no.
Oh yeah, bad situation. And you'll never guess what they find.
A skeleton.
A partially burned skeleton hidden in the guy's lab.
You can't make this stuff up.
No kidding. And here's the thing. Even before forensic anthropology was a real thing, like a recognized field, the experts knew this wasn't random. They looked at the bones, saw they matched Dr. Parkman's build. Get this. They even found a piece of a denture.
Seriously?
Yep, and it matched his dental records. That's one case where you're glad dentists keep good notes.
Makes you wonder what ELSC is hidden in those old basements, right?
Right.
But it gets to this thing that's so cool about forensic anthropology. Those bones, they tell a story. And the book lays out these 10 key questions. It's like a detective's checklist, but for skeletons. We could do a whole deep dive on just those, but a few really stuck with me. Like, first off, how do you even know if something out of a bone? Out in the elements, wouldn't things get messed up look like something else?
Oh, absolutely. The book gives this example, a deer's metatarsal bone, basically from their lower leg. It can look exactly like a human finger bone.
Yeah.
Especially it's old, been out in the weather. That's why knowing your stuff, like what animals are usually in the area, is huge GE.
Otherwise, you're chasing the wrong lead right from the start.
Exactly.
So, okay, say you find something, and it's a bone, no question. How do you tell if it's like human bone?
Yeah.
As opposed to, I don't know, deer bone?
That's where the real expertise comes in. Forensic anthropologists, they know their anatomy, like inside and out.
So they can tell just by looking?
Pretty much. Shape, density, even the microscopic structure, they can spot differences most of us wouldn't even know to look for.
It's like they've got X-ray vision, but for bones.
Not.
Okay, but what about how old the bones are? Is a bone from, say, the 1800s going to look that different from one that's a few decades old?
That's where it gets really cool. It's not just about the bone itself, but also the environment it's been in. Taphonomy, it's called. The book has this example, a Japanese soldier's grave from World War II on Yap Island.
Okay.
Now, you'd think bones from the 1940s, that's not that long ago, they'd be in decent shape, right?
What is this? Yeah.
Turns out, because of the soil there, super acidic, and the humidity, the remains were practically gone. Decades, that's all it took. So the environment can really mess with things.
A skeleton in a desert versus a rainforest, totally different story.
Or night and day.
So time itself isn't always a reliable clue. Okay, last one for now. Let's say you've got a pretty complete skeleton, definitely human. Can you actually figure out WHO it was?
It's not as foolproof as they show on TV, but forensic anthropologists can get incredibly close. They look at the skull, the pelvis, even the length of certain bones, all kinds of clues.
Like what?
Well, skull shape can give you an idea of ancestry. Pelvis, you can tell male or female. Bone length, that can help determine height. There's this case in the book, a transient laborer, initially they misidentified him based on, like, his stuff and assumptions people made.
Right, well, what happened?
They analyzed the skeleton, and it told a whole different story. His skeletal features pointed to a different ancestry than they first thought, helped them track down his real identity.
So the bones themselves set the record straight.
Exactly.
That's kind of amazing when you think about it. But how accurate is all this? Are we talking, like, beyond a reasonable doubt accuracy?
It's important to remember, forensic anthropology, it's science, right? So you're dealing with probabilities, not guarantees.
It's not an exact science, then.
Exactly. Especially with things like figuring out ancestry or exactly how long someone's been dead, it's more about ranges of possibility. That's why they don't work alone, these
All
anthropologists.
right. They bring in other experts, don't they?
Absolutely. Entomologists, botanists, DNA analysts, it's a team effort. They all have their own piece of the puzzle.
That's so cool how it all comes together.
Yeah.
Okay, now for the stuff that always gets me, the, crime show stuff.
Yeah.
Facial reconstruction, expert speaker.
Yeah, right.
You see them with a skull and some clay or, a computer program, and boom, they've put a face to the name. You really like that?
If only. I mean, the idea's been around, but the techniques are way more advanced now. We've gone from that basic clay modeling to software, like really sophisticated stuff that makes these 3D models.
So AI is kind of like art, any science mixed together.
Exactly. It's not just getting the shape right. It's age, ancestry, even their build to make it as real as possible. But even with all that, there's still some interpretation that has to happen.
That makes sense. But when you need to solve a case, how much does facial reconstruction help? Can it actually ID someone?
It can be huge, especially with other evidence. The book talks about this 1935 case, the Buck Ruxton case. Double murder, it was awful, the victims were dismembered.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, they actually used facial reconstructions to try and figure out who they were. And it did help, but it was more like they had fingerprints, clothing, that kind of thing. That's what got the conviction.
So it's a piece of the puzzle, not the whole thing.
Exactly. And it made me think of another thing the book talks about, bite mark analysis.
Ooh.
It's another one of those things, people see it on TV and think it's cut and dried, but it's a lot more complicated.
I can imagine. How clear of a mark are you going to get, especially if there's a struggle?
Exactly. There's so many factors that can affect a bite mark. The book compares it to footprint analysis, actually.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They both rely on matching patterns, right. And there was this woman, Louise Robbins. She was big in footprint analysis, but even SHE had critics.
Wow.
It just goes to show, even in forensics, which is all about science, there can be debate. You have to keep reevaluating things.
It's got to be about the evidence, not just what you want it to be. So, big picture now, after all this talk about forensic anthropology, what are we taking away from this deep dive?
For me, it's that the book really stresses how important it is to be so careful. Observation, documenting everything, and working together. It's not about finding that one magic clue. It's about putting tiny pieces together, and sometimes that takes a team, people with different specialties, and a dedication to getting it right.
And it's not just about, solving crimes, right? It's giving a voice to people who can't speak for themselves, helping families find closure. We even learn about our own history this way.
100%. And that's what makes this field so fascinating. You're not just dealing with bones, you're dealing with people, with stories that deserve to be told. Which actually makes me think, with all the advancements we're seeing, especially with DNA, where do you think forensic anthropology will go from here? What do you think the future holds, for better or worse?
That is a question to ponder. And for anyone listening who's as into this as I am, seriously, check out the book, the resources it lists. It's a rabbit hole worth going down.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy exploring.